Hi guys, so today we're going to start reading Phyllis's Big Test. On the previous Nearpod slide, you heard a recording about asking and answering questions and you saw an anchor chart. That's our job today, is to ask and answer questions while we're reading this text. So while I'm reading, I might pause and ask at that point that you stop and write down a question. If you think of a question while I'm reading, write it down in the margins. It's a great opportunity for you to really be thinking about what you're doing, what you're reading while you're reading it. So, Phyllis's Big Test by Catherine Clinton, illustrated by Sean Quails. Clinton, how funny is that? In 1773, Phyllis Wheatley became the first African American to publish a book of poetry. When she went to London to meet with literary admirers, she became the most famous Black person on both sides of the Atlantic. But in 1772, Wheatley's book almost didn't get published because printers in colonial Boston could not believe that an African-born enslaved girl wrote such wonderful verses all by herself. To prove the poems were her very own, the teenage poet consented to be cross-examined by 18 of the most learned and powerful men of Massachusetts. Phyllis's Big Test. So what do you know so far about Phyllis? So what do you know so far about her? So we already know that she's a young girl, and we know that she is living in Boston and that she's a slave. And we know that she's written a book of poems. So my question that I asked is, what do I know about Phyllis Wheatley? And my answer, I just answered a couple things. So this is a good opportunity for you to write down a question that you're having while we are reading. One crisp early autumn morning, Phyllis Wheatley was crossing the Boston cobblestones with a sheaf of papers held tightly under her arm. When her master, John Wheatley, had offered her a ride to her examination, she said she would prefer to walk. She would make her own way to the public hall, where the most important men of the Massachusetts Bay Colony would examine her and settle the questions once and for all. Was she or was she not the author of her poems? She had spent recent evenings copying and recopying her poetry in her own neat handwriting. She knew each poem inside and out. What kind of questions would they ask? Why should she have to defend her own verse? So at this point, stop and ask another question. My question is, why was this happening to her? And I wonder if people today have a hard time getting things published. Or do people today have a hard time getting things published? As she turned the corner of McCarroll Lane, reading one of her poems, the wind gusted and blew it out of her hand. As the page danced in the wind, she gave chase, catching it before it disappeared. Even if it had disappeared, would it matter? She knew every line, every syllable by heart. She wrapped the pages tightly in a roll, pages of poems that had come from deep inside her and could not be taken away, no matter the outcome of today. Still, she had something to prove, not just because she was young, not just because she was female, but because she was a slave and came from Africa. She paused as a billowing sail moving into the harbor caught her eye. Was this like the boat she had arrived on one day in July more than 11 years before? A slave ship full of human cargo? So stop here and make sure you're jotting down a question that you have. She could remember little about crossing the Atlantic, and even less about her African homeland. She was just shedding her front teeth when John Wheatley bought her on the Boston docks as a servant for his wife, Susanna. They christened their new slave Phyllis, the name of the ship on which she arrived. She remembered the strangeness of the Boston house that became her own, or became her home. Her first winter was so very cold and awful. She survived only by the kindness of her masters, especially the Wheatley's twins, Nathaniel and Mary, who eagerly shared their lessons with the young slave girl. They taught her not just English, but also Latin and Greek. Soon, Phyllis spent more time on her studies than on serving her mistress. As she began to read poetry, glorious sonnets had inspired her to try her own hand at writing, and soon she was reciting her poems to the Wheatley's friends. So here's a good point to stop and jot down what questions you have thought about after reading this section. What questions do you have? One of my questions is, why were they so nice to her? This was a time period when people weren't nice to their slaves overall, and she was enslaved. So why were they so kind to her, and why did they allow her to learn and, learn with their children instead of doing her job as a slave? She had been staying up late night after night, preparing for what lay ahead. Was she ready? Would she ever be ready? Last night, her mistress, Susanna, had taken away the candle at midnight and advised, "Tomorrow you will look them straight in the eye as you answer all their questions. Your talent will speak for itself. They will discover the poet we know you to be. And when your book is published, everyone will know." Phyllis had hoped this might be true. Doubts danced in her head, but she had studied as hard as she could, and she would just have to have faith. She said her prayers, her worries began to fade, and she drifted off to sleep, dreaming of her very own book. So at this point, you should have asked another question on this page. Before you close your book and move on in the Nearpod, I ask that you look back at the questions that you asked. Are there any that you have learned the answer to now? Did you ask questions in the beginning about Phyllis that you can now answer based on reading this far? Once you've done that, you can stop this video and move on to the next slide in the Nearpod.